Shalom. Welcome to Light to the Nations. We're talking about a very compelling and interesting concept, the idea of building the Holy Temple as opposed to the idea of waiting for the Messiah to build it, or the question of, is that right? Is the Messiah supposed to build the Holy Temple? What is the relationship? And we are unearthing a lot of different facets of the whole concept of who the Mashiach is and what effect that will have on the question of the Holy Temple. And last week we left off with the idea, Kesef Mishnah, important commentary, authoritative on the Mishnah Torah, tells us regarding the material in these two chapters, this is to be considered as very good beliefs that we should have, as opposed to a halachic rendering. Now, further here on this very page, on the first page of the 11th chapter of the Rambam's Hilchot Melachim, Laws of Kings, the Rambam also explains to us, after telling us, as we mentioned in the beginning, that the king will arise, the Mashiach, and he will return the sovereignty of the house of David to its pristine state, build the temple, ingather the exiles. He also tells us, and we just alluded to this also last week, he says, don't ever think that the king, the Mashiach, has to perform any sort of signs or wonders or initiate anything brand new in the world, or revive the dead, or any of those type of things, because the matter is not so. And I am translating, by the way, word for word. He says, don't ever think that the king, the Messiah, must perform any sort of signs or wonders, or initiate brand new type of things in the world, or resuscitate the dead, or any such thing, because that is not the case. For, he says, because Rabbi Akiva, who was a great wise man of the generation of the wise men of the Mishnah, he was the armor bearer of the king Ben Kuziva. And he would say about him that he is the king, the Mashiach. And it appeared to him and to all the wise men of his generation that indeed this fellow was the Mashiach, until the latter was killed as a result of sins. And once he was killed, it became understood to them that indeed he was not the Mashiach. And they never asked of him, the wise men never asked of him any sort of sign or wonder. This is what the Rambam tells us, and there is so much incredible information here that the Rambam is sharing with us. Who was Rabbi Akiva? We've spoken about him a great deal. Rabbi Akiva is a very paragon of wisdom and piety. He is synonymous with the authority of the oral tradition. The popular adage is that what Moshe Rabbeinu is to the written Torah, Rabbi Akiva is to the oral Torah. Indeed, on a deeper level, there is even a spiritual relationship we find in the Midrash between Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, his life story is well known. It's incredibly inspiring. He was an ignorant shepherd until the age of 40, and then he was inspired to become religiously observant. He married a woman who had great confidence and faith in him, who sent him off to study the Torah. He went and attached himself to the greatest teachers of that generation, and to make a long story short, after 24 years, Rabbi Akiva became acknowledged as the greatest leader of the generation. He left a tremendous imprint on all of the structure of Jewish law and tradition, and he was known for his tremendous compassion as well as his wisdom. And ultimately he was tortured to death by the Romans for the crime of publicly teaching Torah. It's one of the 10 martyrs that we read about on Yom Kippur. But for our purposes at the moment, what we're emphasizing is Rabbi Akiva, as far as his authority is concerned, as far as his representing the wisdom of the Torah and to speak in the name of the Torah, as it were, as that's what the great rabbis are empowered to do. He made a mistake. And this is one of the most, in general, as a side point, one of the most beautiful ideas that we encounter as we study Torah, that the rabbis, even the greatest tzaddikim of all time, they're human beings. There's no attempt made in Judaism or in the Torah literature, no attempt made to paint the great men and women in some sort of garb of infallibility. They're human beings. Their mistakes are recorded. It shouldn't surprise us that Rabbi Akiva made a mistake, because Moshe made a mistake. Aaron made mistakes. Miriam made mistakes. The forefathers made mistakes. And the beauty of Torah is that we greatly revere our forefathers. We greatly revere our ancient tzaddikim. But most of all, we learn from them. And they're not untouchable. They're not in a place where if you question them, or if you show any sort of doubt about something that they did, that the whole infrastructure of faith is so weak that it falls to the ground, and we say, oh, you can't say such a thing, how could you ever question? No, the Torah makes public record of their conduct and behavior for the purpose of instructing their descendants, us, in the proper ways. And the other major principle that, of course, that this reveals is that tzaddikim can be wrong. And they're only human beings. They can do the best that they can do, and that's all that we are required to do. And this is, I know, a lot different than the mindset that many people have regarding people who reach an exalted level. The idea that many people have is that these people are absolutely, infallible, that they become imbued with some sort of almost, or maybe they'll even call it divine status, and that is absolutely not the Torah's message. And you can't find an example in the tradition of the oral Torah of a greater personality in every way than Rabbi Akiva. He is the paragon of holiness. But he, and indeed his colleagues, were under the impression that the historical figure known alternatively as Bar Kochba, the son of a star, or as the Rambam refers to him here as Bar Koziva, which essentially is a play on words, because that word already, these are Aramaic words, that word reflects deceit or disappointment or falsehood. Bar Kochba, who was a rising star, like that verse from the book of Numbers, the Shevet, the star that shoots forth. The great wise men of Israel were convinced that Bar Kochba was the Mashiach. Another source, the Jerusalem Talmud, specifically tells us, the Rambam here paraphrases it really, when he says he called him Mashiach. He says, he used to say about him that he was the Mashiach. That's what we read here from Halacha Gimel in this chapter. But the Jerusalem Talmud tells us that when Rabbi Akiva would see Bar Kochba walking down the street, he would say, there goes the Mashiach. And the Rambam here tells us also that Rabbi Akiva served as his armor bearer. That's a very unusual expression, and does not necessarily exclusively mean that he actually followed him onto the fighting field and carried his quiver. It may mean that, but it certainly means that he gave him his unwavering and full support as far as both being his rabbi, and Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kochba had a very important and personal relationship, but also as far as lending him all manner of support to the extent of his own students. Historically, it can be proven that his own large amount of many thousands of students became Bar Kochba's army. Bar Kochba's goal in his uprising against the Roman occupation and oppression of Judea his goal unabashedly and clearly was stated as to renew the temple service. These are interesting historical facts that we need to understand in order to understand the mindset of Rabbi Akiva, and in order to understand what it is that the Rambam is trying to tell us here about the Mashiach, and therefore in order to understand the relationship between the Mashiach and the Holy Temple. Bar Kochba minted coins as part of his utter contempt for Roman authority. Because someone who is trying to show disdain for an occupying power, one of the most clear and straightforward ways of showing disdain for the powers that be is to say, I don't even subscribe to your system of commerce. Bar Kochba minted his own coins, and one side of these coins depicted various themes, and one side was always an aspect of the Holy Temple, whether a facade of the entrance to the Holy Temple or some other aspect of the service of the temple, because his entire goal was to rebuild the temple. Indeed, there is a historical opinion that perhaps for a very limited period of time he was successful in renewing the offerings on the place of the altar in the Holy Temple, even though the temple had not yet been built. So this man, Bar Kochba, was a tremendous military leader, and there are sources in the oral tradition that tell us about his bravery and about his courage and about the very harsh and exacting expectations and requirements that he had of all his soldiers to prove their courage. So he was the leader of men who were determined to protect their fellow people, to oust Roman rule from the land of Israel, Judea, and to rebuild the temple. These goals are extremely of religious sentiment. They're extremely steeped in the deepest religious motivation for the honor of HaShem. And this was really what their entire campaign was about. In order for Rabbi Akiva to have been under the impression that Bar Kochba, who was only called Bar Koziva once it was understood that indeed he was a disappointment, that he was not the man, in order for Rabbi Akiva to have made this mistake, and we already discussed the fact that we forgive Rabbi Akiva his mistake, and that we are grateful for the transparency of the recording of Torah tradition, which is designed to instruct us in what it means to be a human being, and that includes making a mistake. But again, we should only merit to be on the level of Rabbi Akiva's mistakes, understand? In other words, they made mistakes, but let's see if we can make the mistakes of these great men, and not our mistakes. But we need to analyze, why did he think that Bar Kochba was Mashiach? Because the concept of Mashiach, the Messiah that many of us are waiting for, is someone who is, in each person's mind, the very epitome of righteousness. Everyone, when they're thinking about Mashiach coming, they have maybe a particular Hollywood actor in mind that they think will best fill the role according to our expectations. That's the way people are. We're very much influenced by this type of thinking. So we have our ideas about his flamboyant style, perhaps, or his swashbuckling manner. And many religious people have an idea of him as being the very paragon of faith, religiosity, Torah scholarship. Indeed, the majority of Torah students, when you ask them about Mashiach, they're going to tell you this is a great Torah scholar. The greatest Torah scholar. Who else could be Mashiach? They'll argue about which yeshiva he's from. But Bar Kochba was not a Torah scholar. He was not known for excelling in Torah scholarship. He was known for his military prowess. He was known for his daring, his bravery, and mostly for his total commitment to the goal. Military leadership, a military leader. So what we've just said is staggering in its implication, and unfortunately people read this and they don't think enough about what it means. Rabbi Akiva, who was to this very day universally revered as the epitome of the scholarship of the Second Temple period, but not just scholarship, but a level of piety, devotion, and attachment to God. The Mashiach that Rabbi Akiva was expecting was not a Torah scholar. The Mashiach that Rabbi Akiva was expecting was a military man. And the mistake that he made, which we forgive him for, was because this man, Bar Kochba, until later on it was proven that he suffered from ego and that there were other very human factors involved which unfortunately disqualified him and which lent to the unraveling of the whole situation. As human beings will do, they will rise to their greatness, and then they will rise to the level of their failure as well. But until that happened, Rabbi Akiva was convinced that this is Mashiach because he fulfilled the criteria that the Chachmei Yisrael, that the wise men of Israel had set for who the Messiah is. And this is such an amazing concept that when we think about it, we can just be absolutely floored at the difference between, according to this source, who Mashiach really is, as opposed to the very, kind of fairy tale, stylistic improvisation of what that notion has become in our minds today. To the extent that the Mashiach that the great Rabbi Akiva anticipated and briefly saw in Bar Kochba, I don't know today if he would arrive, if people would even want him, and let alone recognize him or accept him, because they have a different notion that has become convenient, because it just takes care of all the problems. And they have ascribed to him some sort of supernatural status, which is not at all part of the authentic Jewish idea of who the Messiah is. We're not taking away from the Messiah's greatness. He is the greatest. He is the very epitome of true spirituality, righteousness, and leadership. So maybe the question is, that the Rambam is alluding to, is how is spirituality and righteousness and leadership manifest? It's not necessarily manifest by someone who is totally ensconced in a shrine of Torah study and thus not really in touch with the pulse and the beat of the nation. Bar Kochba was out there fighting for the survival of his people. He wanted to rebuild the temple. That was good enough for the great sages of Israel, including Rabbi Akiva, until it was proven otherwise. So, a number of things we've discussed here so far. We've discussed the fact that, yes, the Rambam indicates as he begins his chapter here, that the king, the Mashiach, will come, he will do this, he will do that, he will build the temple. The Kesef Mishnah, writing on those words, told us, if you recall, okay, you know my job. Everybody remember what I told you in the beginning of my commentary, on the very beginning of the Mishnah Torah? My job is to elucidate the Rambam's halachic points. So thus, the Mishnah told us, on this chapter 11 and 12, I have nothing to say. These are not halachic issues. These are good things for nice Jewish people to believe. Now, there's another idea. And then, now what we're discussing is we're discussing the fact that the Rambam is telling us essentially that, and remember how he began this particular entry in this chapter. He said, don't think that when this Mashiach finally comes, he has to prove himself by doing anything extraordinary, by doing anything out of the ordinary, anything supernatural. He doesn't have to perform any signs or wonders or do something that is absolutely out of this world. He certainly doesn't have to revive the dead or do anything like that to prove that he has some sort of supernatural power. And then he goes on and explains, and how do I know that, the Rambam says? How do I know that you don't have to anticipate that and that that's wrong to think? Because Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kochba was Mashiach. He wasn't supernatural. He never revived the dead. He never showed us any signs and wonders. And Rabbi Akiva would see him in the street and say, there's the Mashiach. And he lent him his full support. And he stopped everything that he was doing to become the spiritual leader, nothing less than this. Rabbi Akiva was the spiritual leader of Bar Kochba's uprising against Rome. But he was wrong because it wasn't Bar Kochba. But this is the person that he was waiting for. And then the Rambam goes further here, and he explains to us that, and here I'll translate word for word again. V'im yamod melech mibeit David, if a king should arise from the house of David, familiar with the Torah, learned in the Torah, and who performs the commandments like King David his father, the written Torah and the oral Torah, and he will bring all of Israel to follow him and strengthen them, and he will wage wars of HaShem, then such a person is in the category of what's called Chezkat Mashiach. That means that he is a valid candidate who we can continue to investigate if he is really Mashiach. Right now he is the candidate. Chezkat Mashiach. Chazakah means that we can ascribe to him the role until proven otherwise. We can now begin to give him the title of, this is probably the Mashiach. This concept of chazakah, that he's now, because of what he's done, he's now shown himself to be, would seem that he has what it takes. But it's still a bit temporary, this chazakah. It means like a holding pattern which is recognized legally. It's a status. Candidacy. But then the Rambam continues and he says, if he went and he succeeded in the wars that he waged, and he builds the temple in its proper place, and he gathers the exiles of Israel, then he is definitely the Mashiach. And he will fix the world, totally rectify it, in order to serve HaShem together. As the verse tells us, the verse in Safanya, for then I will pour out on the nations a lucid language, all of them to call in the name of HaShem and to serve him together. So what did the Rambam do here? Right after telling us about the failed mission of Bar Kochba, right after telling us that, he goes on and tells us that if a person comes along who seems to have the goods and who seems to be have the qualifications, then you can consider and begins to do these things that are described, then you can consider that person might very well be the Mashiach. If you see that he really did it, and he succeeds, and he goes, and he gathers all of Israel together, and he builds a temple in his place, then you know he's Mashiach. Rambam is telling us something here so important, that now we can understand in the context of the long and difficult history of the Jewish people in exile. There is a phenomena that occurred many times in Jewish history. Some of these occurrences are more well documented and famous than others, but it happened many times, and that is the concept of a false Messiah. There were many false messiahs that rose up, and these were terrible tragedies of disappointment and trauma for the Jewish people, just as Bar Kochba was in his time. And the Rambam here is giving us a prescription of how we can tell the difference between the real Messiah and a false Messiah. A person who comes along and starts to look good and begin the work, as Bar Kochba did, to the extent that Rabbi Akiva believed in him, that person, you can say, this very well might be the Mashiach. But we only know it for sure when he succeeded. And then, and only then, we can say, that person is Vadai Mashiach. The Rambam uses the word Vadai, definitely, certainly, of a certainty. So here the Rambam is already alluding to an important concept which is going to color our understanding of what he said in the beginning, but we're not at all finished with our understanding here. But what I'm trying to say here at this point is, there can be a scenario in which the temple is built, but Mashiach hasn't yet come. And indeed, we're going to find that many of the wise men of Israel, many of the greatest rabbis, subscribe to that very opinion. That is the opinion of the Jerusalem Talmud. And we're going to see how the rabbis taught us that the temple can and should be built. And I'm going to prove to you also next time that the Rambam himself, despite what we read here in the beginning of chapter 11, the Rambam himself proves that the temple should be built before the Mashiach comes. And there can be this scenario in which the temple is built and then Mashiach comes. But if Mashiach comes and it hasn't been built yet and he doesn't do it, he's not the Mashiach. So what he's telling us is that this is one way of being able to determine the difference between a false Mashiach and the true Mashiach. If he says that he is, but he hasn't built the temple, that's not him. Because if it hasn't been built by then he has to do it. But that doesn't mean that Mashiach has to come in order to build the temple. And next time we're going to show, indeed, that the Jewish people are commanded to build the temple regardless of when the Mashiach comes. And this indeed is our goal, the building of the Holy Temple, the place of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.